and the slide change as well?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, very good. Because I just had another presentation where exactly that didn't work. So somehow there's always an issue with, for me at least, with Keynote. The slide change as well?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, very good. Because I just had another presentation where exactly that didn't work. So somehow
Okay, well, everything is working, so when you want.
Okay, so I try again to start. So welcome everyone. I will, as already announced in the email, sort of split this tutorial in 3 parts roughly. So I will start with like 25 minutes or so, just an overview of what DarkSUSY is, what you can do with DarkSUSY, and then like provide a bit more technical overview. And then the last and main part, like roughly half of the 2 hours, will be really hands-on sessions. And for that, we will split in breakout rooms. And Joachim, who's already here, will help me to go around from one breakout room to the next and like help you and answer questions while you're working on actual problems. Yeah, and you should also, I mean, since Joachim is already here, so don't hesitate to ask questions in the chat. So even if I don't notice immediately, maybe because I'm talking, maybe Joachim notices and can try to answer already while I'm going. But also don't hesitate to interrupt me. Okay, so what is DarkSUSY? What do you want to do? I mean, typically, well, for sure, we're all interested in searches for dark matter. Yeah, so what we want to do is to look for dark matter in various ways, at colliders and direct searches, indirect searches, but also with astrophysical probes. This is becoming more and more important, in particular for dark matter models that can't be easily probed with these traditional ways. And we basically want a tool that can do all these things in a consistent manner. Yeah, you want to calculate rates for all kinds of observables. Yeah, and this is basically what DarkSUSY is trying to do. Of course, DarkSUSY cannot do everything, and I also cannot cover everything in the 25 minutes that I will speak about DarkSUSY here. So this will just be a rough overview and then some more concrete examples of what you can do. So when you do some dark matter phenomenology, some calculation of dark matter rates, the typical flowchart that you're interested in is something like this. Yeah, so you're interested in constraining some particle physics models. So for example, you choose the MSSM, a supersymmetric model. You can also choose a scalar singlet model, some generic WIMP, whatever. But you have to specify what kind of model you're talking about. And you specify not only the type of model, but also a specific model point, if you wish, by giving the model parameters. Yeah, so ideally, these are just the parameters that would appear in the Lagrangian. For more phenomenological models, it's just, for example, the dark matter mass and some generic coupling constant, for example. And then you can, like with these input parameters, you want to calculate more refined versions of the masses and couplings, for example, taking into account radiative corrections. You want to check for constraints, and then you want to calculate various rates. Yeah, you want to first, I mean, an important aspect, of course, of dark matter is how to produce it in the early universe. So you want to make sure that your dark matter model is sort of viable in the sense that it can explain the observed dark matter abundance that we see. And you want to compare or calculate various rates and then compare it to actual experiments. And finally, I mean, once you have the rates, you can actually compare it to the data. So in principle, all these steps is what DarkSUSY is doing, you know, with a clear focus on these last steps. So in particular, there's a large part of DarkSUSY dedicated to any kind of thermal physics in the early universe, the freeze-out calculations, but also related to kinetic decoupling, which you've heard about in Laura's presentation, and direct detection rates, indirect detection rates, astrophysical rates due to self-interacting dark matter, for example. While these parts here, I mean, this is also done by DarkSUSY, but in particular for more complicated modules like the MSSM, it relies heavily on contributed codes. While finally the comparison with the data is something that is sort of the next step that is not done by codes like DarkSUSY. So DarkSUSY provides the rates, which you then can feed into some global fitting tools, like, for example, Gambit, to compare to data in a very refined and consistent way by combining many likelihoods. Okay, so technically, what is DarkSUSY then? It's just a library of Fortran functions. So DarkSUSY is written in Fortran. And we've tried to make this code as modular as possible with the constraint of Fortran. But also have, I mean, the advantage of Fortran is, of course, that it allows for very fast code, and it is very simple to use. And this is something that I'm trying to demonstrate also in the tutorial today. So then DarkSUSY has, since the version 6, is no longer restricted to the MSSM supersymmetry. So in that sense, we have unSUSYfied DarkSUSY and contains a number of particle physics modules that you can directly use, that are sort of shipped with the release. But of course, it also provides scripts to add new particle physics modules. And in principle, you can use it for any kind of WIMP type or any kind of models that have lead to observables, that lead to rates of the types that I will be talking about here. Okay, so the general code structure is visualized in this figure here that you can also find in the DarkSUSY article. So basically, there are two types of main libraries. There's the core library that contains all the functions and subroutines that are independent of any particle physics. So you, as a user, have to supply a main program, and there are many examples, and these kind of examples we will look at. And this main program that you use to calculate certain rates, for example, an indirect detection rate with gamma rays, links then to the core library, and it also links to one of these particle physics modules. So you basically choose which particle physics module you want to do your calculation with, and that is decided at the stage of building the main program when you link to one of these. And then there are also various other concepts that I will get back to later. Okay, so this is just to give you a brief indication of the fact that DarkSUSY is in a well, very active, I would say, development stage. So there's lots of things going on. So if you decide using DarkSUSY, just make sure to always check out the latest version. And typically, I mean, there's actually new physics being added. So it's not just small updates, but like at least for the recent years, there have been new physics developments that have added new features to the codes. Okay, so key concepts for this modularity that I refer to. The first thing is something that I've already said. So the main program, the thing that you actually want to use, the thing that you will learn how to write, links to the core and one of the given particle libraries. And then a main concept for how this setup works are interface functions. So the interface functions communicate basically between the particle physics independent part and the particle physics dependent part. And the whole idea of this is that the number of these links should be minimal. So in the whole current DarkSUSY release, there's only about a dozen of these functions. So the only thing the core library, the particle physics independent library, knows about particle physics is actually this set of particle of interface functions. So that means that in some sense, this set of interface function defines the particle module as seen by the core library. Of course, if you want to provide a new particle physics model, this can be very complicated to provide, but in the end, this is totally up to you how you would, or how it's up to the particle physics module how to implement this. In principle, you could also provide a particle physics model just by providing the set of the small set of interface functions, and this could be, for example, just a tabulated function that you get from some other code. And you even don't have to provide all the interface functions. You only have to provide those interface functions that are needed by the main program for the observables that you're interested in. So for example, if you want to calculate the relic density, Yeah, you can calculate the relic density for a new particle model that is not included in DarkSUSY, and you don't have to worry about having to implement a whole particle module and all the functions that you may need for that. You only need to supply the invariant annihilation rate. And this is an example that I will get back to, and then the core library already knows exactly what to do about this. Okay, so another key concept, and that is also something that we will explore in some detail in this tutorial, are replaceable functions. Yeah, so the way this is set up here, namely that a main program links to two libraries, means that everything that is inside the library can, at linking stage, so when you build the main program, very easily be replaced, so overwritten. So for example, let's say that you have the invariant annihilation rate for the calculation of the relic density that I already mentioned, supplied by some particle physics model. Yeah, and then in your main program, you want to check how it depends on various effects that you want to add. For example, you want to add a Sommerfeld enhancement factor, or you think that there is a missing factor in the implementation or whatever. Then you can sort of replace the functions of the library, not by actually overwriting them. Yeah, so you leave all the installation completely untouched, but just at linking stages, tell the main program that, no, look, instead of the invariant rate coming from there, take my own user supplied one. Yeah, and this is again a concept that we will explore in some detail, and it is very handy and makes changes very easily to implement. Okay, so then let me just briefly sort of mention some new physics that has been implemented in the newest release. So that's there since DarkSUSY 6, now 2 or 3 years old. So the relic density routines have been significantly expanded. Yeah, so one thing is that there's now full support for relic density calculations in secluded dark sectors, allowing for an arbitrary temperature dependence in the dark sector. Yeah, so the dark sector temperature can be completely different from the visible sector temperature, and still these relic density calculations will work in general. The way the standard Boltzmann equations are solved has also been improved. There's another update that I've not even listed here, and that is for coupled Boltzmann equations. I think this is something that Laura also mentioned in her presentation, in situations where kinetic decoupling, that's the next point, and chemical decoupling are intertwined, such that the standard preconditions for the typical vanilla relic density calculations are not satisfied anymore. So this is something that you also can do with DarkSUSY now. Okay, then we have updated direct detection routines. So in particular, there's a completely new part of DarkSUSY that calculates direct detection rate from cosmic ray accelerated dark matter. So the idea is there that light dark matter in particular can become accessible by direct detection experiments because it is first hit by cosmic rays, accelerated to speeds such that it can be visible in standard direct detection experiments. And I will slightly expand on that example later on. Self-interacting dark matter is implemented. We have new cosmic ray propagation routines, capture routines that are relevant for neutrino signals, and this is something that Joachim will say more about in the hands-on sessions. And also, in particular, so all this is essentially model independent, but for the MSSM, there have been significant developments implementing radiative corrections. Yeah, so to full both the electromagnetic SU2 and SU3 corrections in the MSSM to leading order. And then there are various other smaller improvements that are very, very useful for phenomenological studies. So how do you actually use it? I mean, this is what you want to learn about today, but essentially the first step would always be to look at the example programs that we provide. So there's an extensive main program, both for decaying dark matter and annihilating dark matter, that basically demonstrates how you can use the same program for different particle modules. And then we have also various more specific programs that are sort of more minimal applications that address various ways of using the direct detection routines, indirect detection routines, how to use the database of halo models, or relic density calculations, but also self-interactions. Okay, so let's just, I wanted to spend 10 minutes or so on a few more concrete examples. So let's start with the relic density. So the relic density, this is the Boltzmann equation, and most of you will have seen this before. This describes how the number density of dark matter, this n chi here, evolves as a function of time in the early universe. And of course, there are these two competing effects, the expansion of the universe versus the annihilation rate, both annihilation and creation rate that keeps the dark matter particles in equilibrium at early times. And the whole point is that from the point of view of a numerical solver, you just need to provide this function here. Or more concretely, more correctly, you need to provide this so-called invariant annihilation rate, because once you have this, you can calculate the effective annihilation rate that enters in the Boltzmann equation here. So this is something that I've already mentioned. There have been various improvements here, in particular for cases that are relatively difficult to evaluate numerically, when you have very narrow resonances, for example. This is now captured by an automatic fit to bright Wigner resonances. So an example of this is also given in one of these example codes, and this demonstrates how to use the relic density routines to do high precision calculations of the so-called thermal annihilation rate. So the annihilation rates, in other words, that is required to match the observed dark matter density today as a function of the WIMP mass. So the fact that this is not just a straight line is mostly related to the fact that the number of degrees of freedom changes in the early universe. So when we go below WIMP masses or dark matter masses of around 10 GeV, then at freeze out, we start to probe the QCD phase transition. So this is this part here. Like as we go to smaller temperatures, the number of degrees of freedom in the early universe decreases rapidly. But the inset also shows another example. So I encourage you to look at this example here of how to use this concept of replaceable functions. So we can basically demonstrate how to implement the impact of how we want to use, or how we want to describe threshold corrections. So the vanilla case is to just say that, okay, if you have a center of mass energy that is smaller than the mass of the two produced particles in the final state, then you say that the process is not allowed at tree level, so you just put it to 0. And if it's higher, then the process is allowed and the phase space opens up. So this is this case here. But it would be more correct to say that, well, even if you're slightly below threshold, you can produce one of the particles slightly off shell, essentially implementing a 3-body correction, and then you see a slightly different way, or a slightly different result for the required relic density or thermal annihilation rate.
Hi, can I ask you something?
Sure.
It's about the previous slide. How do you, if I have some particle model, how do I introduce this WEF?
Yeah, exactly. So this is very,
there
very
is
good
another
question.
Program. Sorry. Okay.
So, yeah, that's exactly the point. Yeah. So like from the point of view of the code is ignorant about what WF actually is, where it comes from. It just knows that WF is a function that is only a function of momentum. So as long as you provide any numerical function, if this can be even tabulated, and tell the code, look, this is the interface function that you should use for relic density calculation, the code will happily perform these relic density calculations. So from the point of view of DarkSUSY, it is completely, the model is basically defined by what you give it as input. Yeah, and how you calculate this, we give examples of how this is done, for example, in the MSSM or in other models. But the main point is that you can sort of compute this function just on your own. You can also use other tools. You can use CalCap, for example, to calculate amplitudes and then transform that into a function. And once you have that function numerically provided, then you can use DarkSUSY for that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, good. So then the next example that I wanted to briefly mention is these dark sector calculations. Yeah, so what changes with respect to the standard calculation is that you have to take into account that the temperature in the secluded dark sector can be different from the visible sector temperature. Now, a special case that is also implemented as a special case is that we have a completely secluded dark sector, so that the visible sector and the dark sector have been in thermal contact at some point, but then they decoupled, which at a time or a temperature which I denote as T decoupling here. And if they are completely decoupled, it means that entropy is conserved separately in the two sectors, in the visible sector and in the dark sector. You know that from the visible sector, but exactly the same argument holds for the dark sector as well. But if you have separate entropy conservation, then you can actually compute how this temperature ratio evolves as just a function of the degrees of freedom. Yeah, and this is something that is also provided in DarkSUSY. So it's automatically calculated in a consistent way. And then you just have to adapt the relic density calculations correspondingly. So this temperature ratio enters in, well, three ways. Yeah, it enters in the thermal average. That is a thermal average, which you now have to do with respect to the dark sector temperature, not the visible temperature. The equilibrium number density changes, and you have to take into account the effect of these additional degrees of freedom in the dark sector. Yeah, so basically, we require two new interface functions, namely the number of dark sector degrees of freedom and a function that tells us how the dark sector temperature evolves. And the relic density routines are set up in such a way that as long as you provide these two additional interface functions, it will calculate the relic density. And this is just an example of how it looks like. So this is the standard plot that you've seen before, the yellow line. Now you can also just check what happens if you use instead of a Majorana particle, a Dirac particle. And these are the lines that you get for various dark sector degrees of freedom. So this is an example where you have Majorana or Dirac dark matter annihilating into just this given number of scalar dark sector degrees of freedom. And again, there's a detailed example that is basically used to compute this, the lines shown in this plot. Okay, so then another example is dark matter self-interactions. So this is also a model that is implemented, a very simple model, phenological model, where we just say that there's a dark matter particle chi that couples to some light mediator. Yeah, and then this light mediator also couples to some other light degree of freedom. It could be standard model neutrinos or some sterile neutrinos that live completely in the dark sector. So if it's actually completely in the dark sector, you can really think of this as a fully decoupled model, which, however, still has interesting phenological consequences, because then we can calculate all these processes here. Yeah, we can calculate the annihilation of dark matter particles into these light degrees of freedom, or into the vector mediators that then decay into the light degrees of freedom. But because it's a light vector mediator, you also have to take into account the Sommerfeld enhancement here. Then the self-interaction of dark matter by diagrams like that is taken into account. This is something that changes the inner density and velocity profiles for dwarf galaxies and can address, for example, what is known as the small-scale problems of lambda CDM. And then finally, there are scattering processes like that. Yeah, these are processes that keep the dark matter particles at early times in kinetic equilibrium, like even after they left chemical equilibrium, they keep it in kinetic equilibrium. And if it happens for very long, then this will wash out structures, cosmological structures at large scales even. Okay, so how can we use that in DarkSUSY? There's again an example code, and we basically can, implement in such a model fully consistently the dark sector to visible sector temperature ratio. And then, well, we have three parameters. Yeah, we have the two masses. We have the dark matter mass. We have the mediator mass. This this light degree of freedom, the sterile neutrinos, we just assume to be massless, and we have a coupling. So that's 3 parameters. And then we can use the relic density calculation, including Sommerfeld enhancement, to fix the coupling. So that means we can map the whole model into a 2D parameter space. And that is what is done here. So it's only the dark matter mass and the mediator mass. And then we can compute the cutoff and the power spectrum that is shown in green from these kind of processes. So everything to the left would lead to a cutoff scale that is so large that we would not even produce dwarf galaxies anymore. So this is clearly excluded. In the green region, you would have the potential to address the missing satellite problem, if you think this is a problem. And then we can also calculate self-interaction rates. And again, like everything to the left and to the bottom here, leads to 2 large self-interaction cross-sections to be allowed, while the blue region itself can address what is known as the core versus cusp problem, for example. And then, of course, interestingly, in such a simple model, there's this region where both curves cross. So this is a parameter region where, even with a very simple model like that, you can potentially address all lambda CDM small scale problems. And so this is basically just a demonstration that you can use DarkSUSY to compute observables that are not accessible by classical experiments, but only by cosmology. Okay, so I don't want to talk too much about what DarkSUSY can do, because we want to get to the actual application. So let me just mention, this is basically the idea of this cosmic ray upscattered dark matter. So this is a sketch of our halo. The red one is the magnetic halo. This is where cosmic rays are confined. This is the galactic center. This is where we are. This is the dark matter halo. And the idea is simply that these cosmic rays, the red ones, they of course are relativistic. And if you think about direct detection, this is something you're basically measuring elastic scattering between nuclei and dark matter particles. Just that you typically think of direct detection as something that is a dark matter particle hitting a nucleus, but here it's exactly the same process, just in reverse order. So it's a cosmic ray nucleus hitting a dark matter particle, and as a result, this dark matter particle will be accelerated. So that means that you basically have to take into account 3 steps. So there's a production. You will produce a flux of high energy dark matter particles, which is not accounted for in the standard halo model. You need to take into account that they are absorbed or attenuated, at least, in the soil or the atmosphere. And then finally, there's a detection taking into account a modified velocity distribution of these particles. So these are 3 new, or this is the direct detection interface function that we need also for our standard direct detection. And well, here you can basically see the effect. This is the standard halo model, the velocity distribution of dark matter particles. And then on top of that, you have a small contribution with a high energy tail. And for all of this, you have like example codes. And the main point is that, what used to be a wide area for sub-GeV dark matter is now accessible with these kind of processes. And this is something that you can explore with DarkSUSY. So for those of you who have seen this before, now DarkSUSY has also implemented a full momentum transfer dependence. So you can do these kind of studies for arbitrary matrix elements, not just for constant scattering cross-section that was assumed in this work. Okay, so indirect detection yields, there will be a detailed tutorial about this. So let me just mention again that we've implemented all these radiative corrections for the MSSM in particular, and that can lead to like very large differences between what you would naively expect. So in all these cases, the dashed curves are just the standard results from using Pythia for 2 Barney addilations. And when we take into account all these radiative corrections, you get the correspondingly the colored region. Let me check. Yeah, so the colored region is actually the effect only due to SU2 corrections, while the difference between the dashed line and the dotted line is due to just electromagnetic corrections. So it's basically an additional photon in the final state, so internal branch Darlow. Okay, so More physics example you can also find on the homepage. Yeah, so you see here some examples that I've talked about. There are other examples. This is for the coupled Boltzmann equations. And this is also constantly being updated. And I just encourage you that, like, if you feel motivated after this tutorial or later on to use DarkSUSY in one of your own projects and find or think that you found some nice results, so just feel free to contact us and we can update this here and just provide another example of what you can do with DarkSUSY. Okay, so that's what I wanted to say for the first part. So let me just stop for a moment and check whether there are further questions. So I see that there have been already has been a question on in the chat. Are there any other questions? Can you still hear?
Thorsten, can you see something in the chat or not? Oh.
No, I don't think there's any more in the chat. I mean, there was a question about RGE solvers, and
yes,
you answered that. So this is relevant for the MSSM.
And that's it. Yes.
Okay, so then let's maybe take a 2 minutes break or so, and then I will continue with like the next part that is more about the technical steps of how to get started using DarkSUSY, and this will already contain some small exercises, and then we will naturally get over to the breakout rooms. Okay, so there is a question. So the question is, if you want to calculate the self-interaction of dark matter, so what do we need as input parameters? So the self-interaction rate itself is basically an interface function. So this is something that is provided by the particle physics module. And I mean, there's so far only one example module, and that's the one that I've shown in the example with the astrophysics or the cosmological constraints. That has sizable self-interaction rates. And the point is that typically the self-interactions that result from the exchange of light mediators, they are of a universal form. Yeah? So they take like known analytic forms that are functions of basically the dark matter mass, the velocity, and the mediator mass. And these functions are provided as auxiliary functions. So a new particle module, for example, can just use these functions. Yeah, but you can also have you can define your own new particle module where you have a self-interaction rate that is actually just a constant contact interaction, and then this interface function would just be a constant. I don't know if I answered your question. Ah, yes, okay. Okay, so then maybe let's continue with the second part. So can you see the new screen?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, very good. Good. So then let's try to get started. So this is basically just a summary of what you all should have done before, well, apart from the fact that this is actually 625 now, not 623. So, and several of you already contacted me, and I think we solved all the issues. Yeah, so the issues were always notably related to contributed code, not actually DarkSUSY not compiling, but some of the contributed code has become so advanced that it's actually become a bit harder to compile, just meaning that you need more and more packages basically to be installed on your system. So let me just get back. I mean, so if there is anyone who has not seen this, yeah, you should have all sort of succeeded to install. But if not, like one of the breakout rooms that we have at the end is a dedicated breakout room just to discuss these technical problems. Yeah, so then just, I mean, you can, for example, just go there and try to discuss or ask one of us, like whether we can solve it on the fly. And of course, afterwards, there's also the meeting after this tutorial session. And you can also always contact us by email. Okay, so what do you see when you install DarkSUSY? So basically, you should see this kind of structure. Yeah? So you have a root directory where you've installed DarkSUSY, and then you have a directory that is called source. And everything inside this source directory is the particle physics independent part. So this is all the information that is inside the core library that I mentioned before. And then we have source models. And in source models, there are subdirectories and one subdirectory for each of the particle modules that is implemented. Yeah, so each of these subdirectories will be compiled into one separate library, such that your main program links to this core library here and one of the particle physics libraries. Yeah, and then there are various other directories here, and the one that you will be most interested in, and I mean, until you get a very experienced user, the only ones that you would be interested in is the examples directory. Yeah, so this contains various example programs and test programs. And if you've sort of seen the results from the last slide, you've already successfully run the main test program. And then there's also a manual in the docs folder. So this manual you can create as follows. And in particular, if you make it in this version, it will actually include a full list of all routines and functions, including the respective headers. And these headers are typically much more detailed and contain much more useful information than only the general description that you can find in the manual. Yeah, so just as a general word of warning, I mean, we have tried our best, but writing a manual is a lot of work. And typically when you're wondering about something, it's anyway better to directly look at the code, and in particular, the headers of the respective routines. Okay, so I mean, the main point we've already mentioned in the previous presentation. So DarkSUSY is just a library of routines and functions in Fortran. So what you have to do as a user of DarkSUSY, so you have to provide a main program. So you write a simple main program that links then to the libraries provided by DarkSUSY. And well, many example programs you find here, as already mentioned. So if you haven't used DarkSUSY before, I encouraged you earlier to take a brief look at least at some intro or tutorial. But just to give you the gist of it, Fortran is really simple. So if you have seen any programming language, most likely you will sort of right away understand a Fortran program. You just need to sort of notice the syntax, and maybe the most sort of striking or confusing thing is this convention that you have to indent your program by 6 characters. So this is related to the fact that Fortran is indeed very old, and it goes back to the fact that it was used to be programmed on punch cards, and you just needed it to physically, you have to have this physical separation here. Yeah, so that's just a dinosaur age leftover. But apart from that, everything is very nice. Yeah, so a typical program just consists of a list of variable declarations. Yeah, you have to tell the code what type of variables you have, and then you have the actual program. Yeah, so as we will see in more detail, you will typically always want to start with a call to ds-init that initializes DarkSUSY. Then you can do various calculations and write out your result. So this is an include file. So typically in DarkSUSY, you will use this to include global variables. So in the Fortran language, these are common blocks. These are examples of subroutine calls. These are the arguments. This is a typical pitfall that you are not careful in specifying the arguments in Fortran. So for example, if you only write 1000, the code or the compiler will interpret this as an integer, and then it will not correctly match to the way the function or the subroutine is declared. So you have to make sure that what you enter here really matches the declaration of the variables also in the declaration of the subroutines. Okay, and then we have a function call. Yeah, so these were subroutines. This is a function call, so it's directly assigned to a variable. And yeah, this is of course also useful. A continuation character, you can put anything there. Just if you put it in column 6, the compiler will interpret it as just one continuous line that doesn't stop here. Okay, so then we have the main program in examples, and this is basically well, an example of how to use DarkSUSY. It's very well documented or extensively documented. Oops. Sorry. Yeah, so just an extensive example of what I've just shown you on the previous slide. Yeah, and then I've sort of hidden various tasks here in this presentation, and this presentation is also online on the link provided on the school homepage. And like after the tutorial, this is a good idea, like if you want to look at the details, to just go through these things and try to look into them into more details. Okay, so once you ran this program, yeah, you should get a message like this, including the fact that you can run the same program just with a different module. Yeah, so in this case, the default is to use it with the MSSM. You can also use it with any other model. Yeah, and then you can just check out what happens if you run it with a different model. Okay, so this of course refers back to the structure that we have seen, that when you have a main program, you have to decide. So you always link to the DarkSUSY library, the core library, and then you have to decide which particle physics module to link to. And which one you link to is decided at the compilation stage. Yeah, so that's basically done when you build your main program. Yeah, and you see this here that, well, if you, for example, have a G-Fortran as a compiler, but of course you can also have other Fortran compilers, you know, you just include different libraries, you know, for the MSSM or for the generic WIMP in this case. Now, the way we have solved this is with makefiles, and this is, I mean, really just the same thing. The advantage is just that it is much more flexible and system independent. But under the hood, just exactly the same thing happens. Yeah, so in particular, we have this the same command here, just that we instead of writing out G-Fortran, we have a general variable that is defined during the installation, and that basically knows from your system which Fortran compiler you're using. Yeah, then we have this part here that is exactly this one, and we have the variables here that we would here specify by hand and that are here determined automatically. Yeah, but it's the same idea. And well, one of the main things I want to show you is also as part of this tutorial is how to use makefiles, in particular if you have never used them before. Yeah, so inside the this DS main program here, there are blocks of this type. So these are pre-compiler statements. And this is just for you to know if you wonder how the code then knows which module to use. But in practice, you can just test this by modifying the existing code. Yeah, okay, so then the alternative is to have codes. I mean, this code for the DS main WIMP is very flexible in that you can use the same code to link to different particle modules. But of course, it means that you need a slightly more complicated structure to allow for this. And the alternative is then that you have separate main programs for each particle module. And these lead to much simpler examples, and they are collected. I mean, these are the more specific examples that I've already mentioned and collected in this example AUX. Yeah, so for example, if we compare here the makefile, the important block in the makefile for the main program with just the relic density calculation for a generic WIMP, yeah, you see that here we just directly, I mean, here the module to use is determined automatically from the command line, while here we just directly define it. Yeah, and then you can basically use, and that's what we will do in this tutorial, always just copy and paste the block like this. And if you want, you can add here at these places additional libraries that need to be included that depend on the particle module. Yeah, so in particular for the MSSM, you will need to include all kinds of contributed code or in the form of libraries that, for example, do the RGE calculations. Yeah, so the main thing I want to somehow bring across here is that this looks for sure complicated, yeah, and somewhat scary if you haven't seen makefiles before, but just don't be afraid of makefiles. Yeah, so it's really very simple to use with the examples that we provide. So as you will see, I mean, the only thing that you need to do is to basically copy and paste blocks like this and just change names, like, for example, generic WIMP or the name of the program that you want to provide. Yeah, it's nothing more than that, and then you can exploit the full advantage of using makefiles in your practical applications. Okay, so how do programs look like then? I mean, we've already seen one example. Yeah, so you always start with a call to DSInit that initializes DarkSUSY. Yeah, then you have to define some general settings, maybe read-in parameters, and then that will always be followed by some version of DSGIF model that takes parameters as input, and followed by a DS model setup. And this DS model setup basically does all the things that you can do with these input parameters, you know, like calling RGE, evolution routines, or calculating radiative corrections or whatever. And then afterwards you can calculate what you want. Okay, so even more concretely, yeah, what you should do is you should not modify anything in the downloaded DarkSUSY version in the tree directory of the downloaded DarkSUSY version, but just create some folder, some private folder, and write a small main program with this kind of structure. Yeah, and then you can calculate. You just can copy a makefile from one of the makefiles that we provided. So in particular, in this folder here, because it's much simpler than the generic makefile for the DS main WIMP. And then you just have to adjust the names of the program that you have written, and then you can just type make in your private folder and then run the code. So I just want to stress that this is really the preferred way of doing this. And of course, you can do it in other ways. You can try to run it directly in the installed DarkSUSY directory, but it's not much more difficult at all. And the big advantage is that you don't touch the downloaded version, and that means that your code becomes much more flexible. And also, if there are updates to DarkSUSY, you will automatically be able to use these updates without having to change your code and without having to track your changes and compare, keep track of what you changed. Yeah, so, I mean, this is a task that I actually want you to do now. Yeah, so basically just in your DarkSUSY installation, take this ds-main wimp file, yeah, just copy it somewhere to your private directory, rename it, and then compile and run it. Yeah, so the only thing that you need to do is to change the corresponding entries in the make file for this to work. Yeah, so just have to rename ds-main wimp to my first DarkSUSY program, and then it should work. Yeah, so I just wait 3 minutes maybe, and then we can check the solution, because this is the basic step that we will always use also in all the hands-on examples later on. So the first one who reports that he or she has managed gets a virtual beer or coffee. Okay, I'm not quite sure whether maybe someone has already managed, it's just too shy. Or in any case, I think we should continue. So I just show you here how you can do it. Yeah, so you need to know, I mean, this is the direct thing that I told you. You should just copy this main file to your private folder that I now named my code here. But when you run it, I mean, you will notice that you also need this file dsmain_wimp.driver. Yeah, this is needed by the program. And you need the make file, of course. And this is the one that you need to modify. Yeah, so the modifications that are necessary are just to replace every occurrence of dsmain wimp with my first DarkSUSY program. This should be at 8 places. And then you just want to get rid of this block here, yeah, because this is the block in the make file that describes what to do or how to make, how to compile the program dsmain_decay. Yeah, and since you didn't copy this, of course you don't need it here, and also make wouldn't know what to do with this, and that also means that you want to, I mean, just delete the block here, but also remove it from the target list from the target OR. So if you just type make, yeah, this is basically the list of targets that is performed. Yeah, so whatever comes after OR. Okay, so this example is also, I mean, if you want to take a look, I mean, this is an example that is also included in the version that is already uploaded on the under the link provided at the school homepage. Okay, good. So then let's move on. Yeah, I should maybe stress. I put this light bulb here. Yeah, so the one thing that in practice often causes problems when you do this the first time is only this thing here. Yeah, so makefiles distinguish between tabs and spaces. So you need to make sure that when you copy it, or in whatever way you did it, that you do not replace tabs by spaces. So in particular, these things here at the beginning are actually tabs. So if you replace them by a number of spaces, the makefile will not work. Okay, so then let's continue. And this is the first task then already for the hands-on session, yeah, that you can get back to actually create a little first program, not just copying an existing one, but actually write a little program that will be like 15 lines or so at most for how to use DarkSUSY. Yeah, so and this is the first task that you can do explicitly in the breakout room sessions. Okay, so but before we get there, I also want to get back to these basic concepts. Yeah, so we've talked about interface functions and replaceable functions. So replaceable functions are a very important concept, and we want to learn how to use them as well. Yeah, so the typical use case, or one use case, is that you want to replace something, that you want to change something that is implemented in DarkSUSY. Yeah, and that's an example that I mentioned already in the first part. So let's say that you have the invariant rate, which is an interface function, and you somehow want to check what happens if you change it. Yeah, so whenever you want to do that, so let's say that you want to add an additional factor in this function, or completely replace it with a numerical interpolation, for example. Yeah, so just don't try to directly add it in the code and recompile the code, but really make use of this extremely powerful concept of a replaceable function. Yeah, so just try to think of the installation folder of DarkSUSY as something that you really don't want to touch. Yeah, you want to find another solution for addressing this. Yeah, so the way to do this is then by a replaceable function. So you want to replace, in this case, it's the invariant rate from the scalar singlet model, so the Silvera Z model, the ds_unwx, and you want to replace it with a function that adds this additional factor here. Yeah, so this is the second problem, the second task for you in the breakout room sessions, and this is basically address. I mean, the way how to do it is already demonstrated in the examples aux folder. When you look at the two different targets, I mean, two different targets for the generic WIMP_OH2, the relic density. This code, the same Fortran file, has two targets in the makefile, and one is without replacing this function ds_unwx. The other one is with replacing it. Yeah, so you just have a look at this and take that as an indication, as a hint for what to do. Okay, so then it's time for the breakout rooms, but before, I just want to check whether there are any questions.
Maybe the people are thinking about it.
Yes. So, I mean, of course, there are also, like, there's plenty of possibility to think about questions in the breakout room sessions.
Sure.
So now you have two very concrete problems to work with. So Joachim has already set up 6 breakout rooms, and you will recognize these rooms as the ones that I've announced in the email. And there were also very clear preferences. Yeah, so most of you were interested mostly in the gamma ray spectra, followed by the neutrinos. and that guided a bit the level of effort and details we put into the material there. Yeah, you should not be discouraged to go to any of these examples here, but in these two examples, there will be more detailed and more sort of step-by-step material and more detailed solutions, while we do provide sort of tasks and problems for all the examples. Yeah, so you can just go there, and you can basically this will be common to all breakout rooms, start with these problems 1 and 2 that I've already introduced. You can start right away, and then Joachim and me will basically start to go around and see whether there are any concrete problems, concrete questions that you have, and try to help you. So as I said, there's also this additional breakout room, just general technical support, I call this. So any sort of more technical questions that you want to take up, this is a possibility, or afterwards in the session after the tutorial. Yeah, and of course, like, this is supposed to be sort of an active breakout room kind of thing. So it's the kind of hand-on session that you would typically have in person. So imagine that you actually sit next to each other and only share 3 or 4 computers and just actively try to help each other, because it's only me and Joachim going around. So if you don't talk to each other, it will feel rather lonely. Okay, so then you can choose a breakout room and just start there.
Sorry, Thorsten, maybe we have one question chat.
Yes.
From Julia.
I didn't see.
Okay.
Okay, so which one I would suggest? Yeah, so I mean, both the, let's see. So the standard relic density will be a like natural continuation of the first 2 tasks, but the yields are maybe most simple. I would say. I don't know whether Joachim wants to say anything about the neutrino signals. Maybe this is also a good, well suited for an absolute novice. What else the question?
Yeah, I think the neutrino one is going to be one of the simpler, technically speaking. Might be, but also I think because some of the others involve more of these technical issues that Torsten talked about. But I have a question for you, Torsten. Before I click the open all room button. So the material for the additional problems after problem 1 and 2, how do we distribute it to the rooms?
Yes, I mean, it will. I mean, I will just put it on the web page. So on, let's see, can maybe share the web page.
Yeah, maybe you share the link first, and everyone makes sure to copy it.
Yeah, I think everyone has the link from the because it's a link. It's directly linked from the school homepage. Yeah, so in the list of contributions, you will have one link, or I mean, they're both. I mean, there are 2 places actually where it's linked from. So one from the hands-on sessions and one from the contributions in the school. Each time there's one link to the DarkSUSY session, and then you see that, I mean, the overview is already there. The getting started guide is there. As we go, I will also put solutions to problem 1 and 2, and I will put the slides for the various breakout rooms there.
Okay, I put the link in the chat.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay, so I will open the rooms then, and then you should be able to, it should be set up so that you can choose which room to join, and then you can choose to come back to the main session. We also have this technical issues room. And of course, Torsten and I are only 2 people, and we can't be in all 6 rooms, so we'll try to mingle around. I think there's also going to be a ask for help button. If you click that one, I think we should get some notice, but we'll see. So I will open the rooms now then.
Perfect.
Yeah, and I mean, do consider to switch on your cameras for the breakout room sessions, because it's much nicer to interact and communicate when you see whom you're talking about to. So everyone knows how to choose a breakout room? Yeah, so basically if you go down to this green area in Zoom, and there are these sort of dots, and there you can go to the breakout rooms.
I think they should have gotten a dialog window as well.
Well, maybe I stop recording the video now because it's not possible to record, I think, all the rooms. Okay.
Yeah. Yes.